I got involved in Ithaka in mid 2020, in August actually of 2020, when Gabriel Shipton rang me, and he proposed an idea that he wanted to make a film about Julian, his brother, that focused on their father, John Shipton. That was the premise. That was the idea of the documentary. John had been campaigning since pretty much since Julian was put into Belmarsh in 2019. John had devoted his time and to traveling the world, speaking on Julian's behalf, or at least advocating for him for his release. And Gabriel got involved when he came over also and visited Julian around that time. And he felt motivated to try and do something. And Gabriel's background is that he's a filmmaker. And he said about trying to find a filmmaker that he could partner up with. And he came across my name, and we spoke in August 2020. And pretty much very quickly, I was on board. I really wanted to be involved as soon as he told me the idea of it, as soon as he told me who he was, and that it was going to focus on this family that were trying to save one of their loved ones. That, from a universal perspective, really interested me as a storyteller or a filmmaker. And I think Gabriel and I connected on a very human level in terms of just wanting to go on this journey together. And within a month, I was in London for that extradition hearing in September 2020. And that's when I met Stella and John, and we embarked on this journey to film them over the next kind of 6 months, really, through that period. And interestingly, Stella had really only come out publicly as Julian's partner and the mother of their kids 6 months prior to when I met her. So she was very early in her, I guess, journey of becoming a public figure, and seeing where she was then and the awareness of who she was, and her public speaking and all of that. I was really fascinated to follow, although at that point she wasn't necessarily as involved in the documentary as she ended up being. So it was a bit uncertain, and she was a bit cautious, I think, around getting involved, because we really went into this documentary, Ithaca, and the idea to follow John, and we put a lot of energy into that. And as we got to know Stella, and she, I think, became more comfortable with her position as a public speaker, public person, and kind of stepped into the glare of the media, we were able to kind of chart that as well, which I think was a really wonderful balance of the two stories and the two characters, two very different people going through this process. And what I saw from that point to now is an enormous change in the public support, an enormous change in, the support from the press around the world, enormous change from the politicians speaking out globally as well. And I think it has a lot to do with the change of governments, and particularly in Australia, we had a change of government, I think, I'm going to say 2022. And the previous government wasn't supportive of Julian, and this government is openly supportive of Julian. So that has put the subject matter on the table, and also allowed the press to report it and also question the government. And that's happened around the world. So I think as elections happen around the world, we can see the people's voices being heard. It comes up in, political debates. It comes up in election time. And all of those evolutions, I think, have an opportunity for the story to get out and people to understand what's at stake. I'd followed it in the news, and I probably became aware of Julian in 2010 when the collateral murder video was first published, and WikiLeaks as well. And that's when it really kind of hit my consciousness. And I was pretty fascinated actually with what he was doing at the time. We're talking really early internet, in terms of it being a mainstream thing. I mean, YouTube was only 5 years old when WikiLeaks kind of hit the scene globally. And you look at, that was only, 12, 13 years ago now when I became aware of WikiLeaks. And so in that decade, in that period, I followed WikiLeaks and Julian's story in the news. But that's all I knew of it. I hadn't read any of the books that had written. I'd seen the documentaries that had been made, but it wasn't really until I got a deeper understanding, a deep dive into making Ithaca, that I could read about kind of the story behind the scenes. That really fascinated me as well. What was unreported, what the defence put up in the case against his extradition, details like that, witness testimony, the spying that went on in the embassy, etc. So things like that. Also, Julian's philosophy, the idea of why WikiLeaks was created. Um, it's a really fascinating time for me, and it kind of fed into this fascination I had around journalism as well, which is reflected in Hearts and Bones, is one of the dramas that I made. It focuses on a war photographer. So all of that was bubbling away when I was writing this other film. And then so to have Gabriel call me, 5 years later, when I'd written a drama about that world, it was just felt like a natural progression as well. It's a really interesting process in cutting a documentary, particularly when you have that much footage. Certainly, you go in with an idea of what the premise is, and talking about that it was a father's trying to save his son. That was kind of the idea. That was the story we wanted to show. I had no idea what John Shipton was like. I didn't know how much of his personality was going to be in the film, and when I discovered what he was like and who he was, I wanted as much of that to come in, because I felt like John was a gateway to understand Julian, and Julian being this global figure that was only understood through the news, to have this other portal, a proxy as his father, this really personal connection, was a wonderful way to investigate who Julian was and give audiences maybe a different understanding of who Julian is through just spending time with his father. So that really interested me. But in terms of tackling that type of the amount of footage, I'd had some experience prior. I did a documentary over 7 years, and so we cut that down to an hour and a half. But really, is just a very methodical process of working through, for me, what moments touch you. And some are key in terms of information, some you need for exposition, but others are just following the emotion of the story. And it's a chronological process of saying, okay, it started here and it's going to finish there. The hardest thing is working out what the end is. But in that, you can see the gaps and you can understand what the audiences need to get from A to B. And it's those little bridges that become really hard work to work out how do you get from that scene to that scene, and what the audience needs to know in order to progress. And so with Julian's story that we were trying to tell as a subplot in terms of the backstory of where WikiLeaks and who they were and the details around the court process, that was really challenging, because you had this very humanistic story of the father on the road advocating for Julian, and then you had this very dry court process going on behind a wall that we couldn't see. And so we relied on these cards that gave us information, and then we would intersperse that with John advocating, speaking to the press, speaking to the activists, spending time with Stella and the family, the kids, and the extended family. So the film fluctuated between what I thought was a very humanistic take and gave you enough information that you could also get an understanding of what was going on legally. But I was far more interested in the human emotional aspect of the story. And if I could have made a film that was just John and Stella without any other things going on, I would have loved to, but it would have, I think, confused an audience, because you need to know these things. And the tragedy of the story is what was going on behind the scenes in that court, the extradition court proceeding. So the balance of those two things was the most challenging in trying to tell the story of Ithaca. Yeah, look, it weighed on me heavily, because I mean, I described it as a film, not a campaign film, but a film about a campaign. And the people who I met along the way and that really touched me were the campaigners, were the activists that were on the ground, that would turn up in the middle of a London winter and stand outside the embassy or the courthouse and advocate for Julian, hold a sign up. Now, they could have been out, on the street advocating for any other cause, but it was what really touched me was that it's these people through history that make change. The people that get out of their bed and go down on the street in person and stand there for hours, days, weeks, months, years on end, some of the cases of these people. I felt John was far more connected to those people than he was to the legal team or the people in the press or the politicians that he was speaking to as well. These people that many of them have a lived experience of oppression themselves, or family members who have disappeared in Latin American countries. So they understand what it means like to lose their freedom. In balancing what I thought was an advocacy piece for Julian and for his cause, I was highly aware that people were going to be aware of that going into the film. And I wanted it to show what it looked like to campaign for something you believed in that was bigger than you, and also an opposition or a force that was more powerful than you. And so there are times when you're overwhelmed, and I think that's what we saw with John in that moment. A tired old man, if he doesn't mind me calling him an old man, in his later years, who was overwhelmed by months, years of being on the road trying to do something. And the one question that I always had in the back of my mind is, how do they keep going? What is it that makes them get up in the morning and do this? And I had that for the activists, and I had it in the back of my mind for John. And it's funny, we would never talk about the word hope, because it's an imperfect word, and it's a word that it's not sustainable in a way. So when John has a moment of reflection and says, these years have been wasted. It's a hopeless. I don't think he said it was a hopeless cause, but he said these years have been wasted. Julian's lost a decade or more now. He was 50 at the time. John, the time that he spent, he'd lost with his daughter. That's the sacrifice. And I think that the title of the film is really important in trying to answer that question of how do they keep going, because they keep going through those little moments where they connect with each other, those phone calls that John has with Julian, where they understand and are able to connect on a human level. When John could say to his daughter that he'll be home in a month, the sacrifice is enormous. And ultimately, the only way that they keep on going is that they understand that what they're fighting for is bigger than themselves. And it's a really mysterious thing. But when you see it, you can see how determined these people are. And I would often talk to audiences about, when they watch the film, is ask themselves what they would do if they had a loved one in the same situation. And ultimately, of course, they would do what John's doing, and that's what keeps him going, and that's what keeps Stella going. And there's something in the heart of the people who go out and stand on the street that keeps them going, because they think about the loved ones that were lost, or the suffering that they themselves had suffered under some sort of form of oppression. So there's a solidarity there, there's a humanity there, and all of that's reflected in a very gentle way through the film. And in some ways, that's the quality of the film that people take away. And they don't take away the advocacy, they take away the strength and the humanity and the solidarity. And that's universal. And so they're the things I was trying to explore. And if people walk in with a position, I wanted them to open them up to the emotion of the situation. And I felt that when they were in the presence of a loving family trying to fight for a loved one, in that moment, they would be open to the story of Julian. And so that was the first thing I wanted to do, is just put them in a position where they might think of their own situation. And I think that we've done that to some success in the response we've had around the world. But it's a very, very difficult story to tell, because it's so complicated. But when you boil it down to a family story, I think that's when it has its most power, and then you can see it for what it is. No, I honestly think the most powerful process is a slow and gentle process. You know, um, in some of the breakthroughs that have happened during the time that I've been, most closely following it over the last 3 years, the big breakthroughs have happened with the most unexpected meetings or coincidences or connections of people. One that comes to mind is when the New York Times and the Guardian, El País, and Le Monde all got together, and this was only a few months ago, published
Yeah,
a
that's
letter
bigger.
in support of Julian. That was incredible. And I don't know how that came about, but it was something that really affected and kind of pinpointed and pierced the mainstream, and I think pushed it in people's consciousness. Up until that point, there'd been a lot of coverage, but it hadn't been within those outlets, those mainstream outlets. And what that did was, I think it gave the permission for those larger kind of TV network outlets to then report on that. So it just kind of spread. But it was through, I think, years of kind of a gentle advocacy, one person to another, talking to another. That's how I think change happens, and I think that's how effective change happens. John, I saw him in an interview talking about it was that when the US pulled out the Afghanistan war, that was I think the longest war that America's been involved in. I think it's certainly the longest war Australia's been involved in. But what John said is that the revelations that WikiLeaks published finally had an effect. The illegality of that war, the tragedy of that war, the mysterious nature as to no one knew what anyone was doing there, the damage, the toll it took on that country, still wasn't enough for the Western forces to pull out. But the revelations that WikiLeaks made slowly worked their way into the consciousness of the population, and then eventually wound up kind of overwhelming, I think, the politicians themselves, and eventually they kind of had to pull out. But it was over a slow period of 2 decades that mindset took to get into the population. And I think it's the same thing with Julian, is that there's been so much opposition to him, such an effective campaign against him, that the counter to that takes a long time to seep in. And I think it really is people talking to their friends and loved ones and family and colleagues about the issue. I think it's people getting out and marching. I think it's people doing interviews. I think it is a slow process. And I confidently believe that things don't change until they do. And it seems like then at that point they change overnight. But when Julian is free, it will seem like the last decade or so of campaigning to free him just happens all of a sudden. And I feel that change coming, and it's all heading in the right direction, because the last 3 years I've only seen it grow, And like I said, there's going to be periods when, like in the last week with this decision, that there's a pushback. But the overwhelming force is with the people, and I think it's growing. And I think that is the thing that'll make the change, is the people just advocating, calling their politicians, all of those campaigns that are going on, people wearing T-shirts, I mean, all that sort of stuff. It is making a change, I think, and it is working. But it's just a slow process. But things that last forever take a long time to build. And I think that, in my mind, it's the movement that Julian started is what will free him ultimately. Because when you speak to people about the work that he did and the publications he made, that is the thing that they all believe in. And the principles upon WikiLeaks, what it was built, that's the thing that people connect on. And the support for Julian is across all spectrums of politics. It's the one issue that unites everyone. And that in of itself, I think, is a really important thing, that you can disagree on a whole bunch of things, but Julian work, people can agree on that he's done remarkable things, and I think history will judge that. And so, it's I think we're heading in the right direction. Just slow going sometimes. It's really hard because I talk to people in the US, and the whole thing's a free press thing, and it's the First Amendment, and you talk to people in Australia, and it's, he's an Australian citizen, and you talk to people in Latin America, and look, the one thing I would say is that there isn't a country that hasn't been touched by the work of WikiLeaks. I mean, arguably Julian is the most famous Australian in the world. The other one, ironically, is probably Rupert Murdoch. But the uh, the publications, have touched every country in some form or fashion, and it's probably revealed something about the way that country works, which is, help the people or the populace in some way. Um, but I think it's different in different places. I think probably the hardest country. I mean, we got more pushback in America from the press in terms of
Right.
the coverage of Ithaca in Variety and New York Times and all that. European outlets were far more supportive, and I think Australians press were a lot more uh, positively received the film. And when I say they positively received the film, they received the story of Julian more positively as well, because I put them together.
Mm.
Um, if I had to condense what I think, I don't know. It's so different everywhere. I mean, it's the right to know and a free press. I don't think anyone can argue against that. you know, and people understanding the stakes as well, and the precedents that this sets as well. In you mentioning the multipolar world and the shift to that, I think that the shift that's going on there um, is really interesting, because I think that most of the global South are far more in support and far more aware of WikiLeaks and Julian's work. And it's it's desperate times for America, I think, because they're
Mm.
seeing their declining power. And so when you see the rise of the global South, I think real opportunities for things like transparency and free press to be on the front of the agenda, because the truth of what's really going on is always going to be far more important for us to make decisions about probably the biggest political shift that's happened in a century or more. So I think those times are coming, and those discussions will start to happen more and more. But as they do, I think the desperation by which the traditional powers are hanging on in the world will also amp up as well. So
Yeah.
it's a really critical time. But I think you're seeing protests everywhere around the world, and change of governments, and often what is always on the agenda, on the front of the agenda, is a free press. And so that battle's going on everywhere, and I think Julian's at the center of a lot of it. I mean, watching John and Gabriel campaign, and all the campaigners around the world, they really work the opportunities. And I think if there's an opportunity in front of them, that's the avenue they'll go. And hitting your head up against some other idea that you might have, and it's not getting any traction, is wasted energy. And I think that in terms of a sustainable um, position on being an activist, if you're getting feedback from progress, that's what will sustain you. Whether
Yeah.
or not it's the most effective avenue, you don't know, because it's such a big thing. But if you are getting feedback that you're getting either more signatories to something, or you're getting more meetings with politicians, you're getting more press time. I mean, any
Right.
measurable thing, if you can work an avenue, I think that's where the activists, and I know that I can see that John and Gabriel are doing. But when you look at, like, when the squad, the
Right.
team, the US
The Rashida
politicians,
Tlaib
when
letter.
they signed a letter,
Right.
that was a huge breakthrough. I don't know how that happened, but that's probably the biggest breakthrough that they've had in the US. But they answer to their constituents, and there is a feedback loop with their constituents, so that their constituents, like AOCs and the others, they would see that they signed that. And the ones that weren't on board would be curious as to why. And then they start looking into the issue. But there has been, I think, a concerted effort by their constituents. They must poll their constituents to find out if they're in support of Julian. And if they are, why? So, they're probably thinking free press, they're thinking free First Amendment, but they also have motives in of themselves. I'm sure politicians have made this a point because it benefits them, but it benefits them because their constituents vote for them and they think that they can get some traction in the press. So there's all these, different motivations going on, but the avenues of opportunity for the campaign are being worked because those opportunities are revealing themselves. And so you could have 5 things going on, one of them pays off, and you think, okay, I'm going to keep working that. The other thing that's really interesting, I find, that's going on is that previous campaigns, that Julian's campaign can measure itself against, whether it be Daniel Ellsberg, looking at how, he shifted the public narrative because he was in a very similar position with the Pentagon Papers, and how he was able to, and he had a smear campaign against him and all of those aspects. And so, when you look historically, now you look at where Daniel Ellsberg sits in the mythology of the American culture, it's a very different position to where he was when he first released it, and he was up against the president, he was up against the CIA, very, very similar kind of opponents that Julian has. And so, I don't have any answers there, but I think that if you see good feedback, if you see good results, then keep working those avenues. I would say to anyone, that's probably the best advice I would give, because I've seen it work. And on the same front, I've also seen it where people think they have a great idea to work, in a campaign, and they're not getting any results, they're not getting any traction, they're not getting whatever they think that they might want to get out of it, and they become exhausted, and they become hopeless and despondent. So it is I think it is a sustainability thing. And I think it also is a way of measuring, how successful the campaign is, the messaging is, etc., etc. Oh, look, it's totally changed my life. It's totally changed my understanding of how the news works. It's changed my understanding of the political relationships that our countries have with each other, between Australia's allies, etc. And how decisions are made on political level. And I think that there's a lot at stake here for the everyday people. I wish people understood that. Trying to pull away some of the complexity of the issue is really hard. What surprised me the most? The whole journey's been just a kind of a really interesting, enlightening thing. But I I think it's the people that I met along the way. You know, like I said, speaking earlier, speaking to the people on the street, hearing their stories, why they were there, hearing their stories of oppression of themselves or their families, the countries they'd come from, really touched me, and it made me understand what it meant when our freedoms are lost, because it's a really abstract thing for most people in the West to understand that, because they haven't experienced it. And also, actually, when we met Ai Weiwei and he came down to the court to show his support of Julian, one thing he said that I thought was really interesting was that he said the fight is the thing. In the fight, there is meaning, because in this kind of long period in which people spend trying to affect the world, it is in that action of fighting where the understanding comes from as to what is actually we are doing, what are we actually fighting for, and it is the purpose. It is that struggle that is the purpose. So I kind of take strength from that, and it's sustaining, and it also there is a tiny little bit of hope in there. Is that what you're doing is what you're meant to be doing, and ultimately the destination is not the thing, but is the fight that you're in now is more meaningful. going back to Julian and WikiLeaks, I think he was very critical of the countries that he loved the most in terms of the ones he knew the most. He was critical of Australia. He admired the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights and all that, as so many countries do, because they're such remarkable documents. And they held them to that, and I think what's happening now with Julian is that because America seems so hypocritical by targeting Julian, that all the other countries now can hold him up as as an example of what then they can then suppress other journalists, so no one's held to higher ideals anymore, even the ones that have these incredible documents, so that's where the whole system falls down, I think. When you have that level of hypocrisy, I think other countries just, are fed up with that, and that's part of, I think, where you get that division around the world, and not even mentioning the last 200 years. So.